He thought the war ended the day he stepped off the plane, but the silence that followed proved otherwise. The house on Maple Ridge Road was small, barely 1,200 square feet, with faded blue siding and a porch light that hummed softly in the Colorado evening. And inside that quiet house sat a man who had once led patrols across deserts half a world away. Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter, broad-shouldered, 37, a Marine whose boots now rested on a living room floor instead of sand hardened by years of conflict. Yet the war had not stayed behind where it belonged. It had followed him home, in the shape of restless nights and sudden stillness. In the way he sat on the far end of an old brown couch, staring at nothing while the clock on the wall ticked louder than it should. Across the room, not more than 15 feet away, lay a German shepherd named Rex, a dog once trained to walk ahead of Marines and trust his nose more than any machine. A dog who had saved lives more times than anyone kept count of, his coat dark sable with silver threading through the fur along his back, ears tall and watchful even when his body remained still. Rex did not sleep. He watched, always watching. The room smelled faintly of black coffee and worn leather, the kind of quiet scent a soldier carried home without realizing it. And the only sound between them was the soft breathing of two survivors who no longer knew how to relax in the same room. Months had passed since Daniel brought Rex home from the base. Months since the doctor said both of them were cleared to return to civilian life. But something about that word, civilian, felt wrong in this house, because Rex did not trust the outside world anymore, and Daniel did not trust the quiet inside his own head. Neighbors had noticed it too. The dog never barked when Daniel moved through the house, never flinched when he spoke, but if a stranger stepped within 10 feet of the front gate, Rex would stand, muscles tightening, amber eyes narrowing with the sharp patience of a soldier still on patrol. People whispered about it in town. Some said the dog had become unstable. Others said war dogs were never meant to live normal lives. The veterinarian had suggested. A behavioral specialist, then later a calmer voice, had mentioned the possibility that Rex might be too dangerous to keep around families, the kind of sentence spoken gently, but heavy enough to hang in the air for days afterward. Daniel never answered those conversations. He only sat here at night on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though the right thought might appear between the wooden boards. Rex watched him from across the room the same way he used to watch doorways in distant places, head slightly lowered, body quiet but ready, as if guarding something invisible that only he understood. Outside, the cold Colorado wind brushed through the pine trees behind the house, and the porch light flickered once, a tired bulb humming against the dark. Daniel leaned back slowly, exhaling the kind of breath a man lets out when the day is finally over. But the moment his eyes closed, Rex lifted his head, ears turning forward, alert again. Not aggressive, not restless, just waiting. Because somewhere inside the silence of that house, the dog had already learned something no one else had yet understood. Morning arrived slowly over Maple Ridge Road, the pale Colorado sunlight stretching across frost-tipped grass and touching the quiet windows of Daniel Carter's house, as if unsure whether it was welcome there. The heater hummed softly somewhere behind the walls, pushing warm air through narrow vents while the scent of coffee drifted into the living room, stronger now, darker, the way Daniel preferred it after too many nights of restless sleep. He stood at the kitchen counter holding a plain ceramic mug, his shoulders broad but heavy with a kind of stillness that had followed him since returning home. And through the doorway Rex watched him with the same steady patience he had carried through deserts and dusty checkpoints long before this quiet town existed in their lives. The dog had not moved far from the spot where he slept during the night, but his ears tracked every sound Daniel made, every step across the floorboards, every soft clink of the mug touching the counter. Outside, a pickup truck rolled past the house at no more than 20 miles per hour, tires whispering along the narrow road. And Rex lifted his head slightly before relaxing again when the sound faded into the distance. Daniel stepped toward the living room and paused halfway, leaning his shoulder against the wall as if gathering the energy to cross those last few feet. The distance between him and the dog was small, barely the length of a pickup truck bed, but it felt wider than the open fields beyond town. Rex noticed the hesitation immediately. The shepherd rose slowly, not stiff or aggressive, just alert, his amber eyes fixed on Daniel with quiet attention. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The morning light filled the room now, revealing the faint scars along Rex's flank, the kind earned during years of service that the town veterinarian had once traced gently with her fingers while whispering that this was a brave animal who had seen too much too young. Daniel remembered that appointment clearly. The clinic had smelled of antiseptic and pine cleaner, and the veterinarian, Dr. Helen Brooks, had spoken carefully while Rex lay beside Daniel's chair, calm but watchful. She had explained that ward dogs sometimes carried invisible weight long after their missions ended. They stayed alert. They stayed ready. Their minds did not easily forget the habits that once kept people alive. Daniel understood that better than anyone in the room, but understanding did not make the silence easier. Now, standing in his own living room, he watched Rex the way soldiers watch the horizon, measuring small movements, searching for signs he could trust. Rex tilted his head slightly, reading the tension in Daniel's posture with the instinct that had once guided him across dangerous ground step by careful step. The dog took one quiet pace forward and stopped again, waiting. Daniel lowered himself onto the couch with a slow exhale, the cushion sighing under his weight. For a moment, he stared at the mug in his hands as steam curled upward into the morning light. Then, without thinking about it, he set the mug on the table and rested his forearms on his knees the same way he had done countless times in barracks rooms and temporary shelters overseas. Rex watched the motion closely. The shepherd's ears shifted forward, and after a pause that stretched several heartbeats long, he walked the rest of the distance across the room and settled onto the floor beside the couch. Not touching, not crowding, just close enough that Daniel could hear the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing, steady and patient. Like a sentry who had decided that, for now, the morning was safe. The quiet in the living room carried a strange weight that morning, the kind of silence that often followed men home from places they rarely spoke about, and Daniel Carter felt it again as he stared toward the window, where pale Colorado sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor like a memory trying to return. Rex remained beside the couch, calm but watchful, his breathing steady, his eyes moving not toward the door or the street, but toward Daniel himself, as if the dog understood that the real battle no longer existed outside the house. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly, feeling the rough skin along his knuckles, and somewhere deep in that quiet moment another place surfaced in his mind, a landscape of pale dust and distant hills where the air smelled dry and the horizon shimmered under relentless heat. Years earlier the mornings had sounded different there. Instead of wind through pine trees, there had been the low hum of armored vehicles warming under the sun, the distant voices of Marines checking equipment, the metallic clink of gear against concrete barriers. That was where Rex had first learned the rhythm of Daniel's footsteps. The dog had been younger then, lean and sharp-eyed, trained to walk several feet ahead of the patrol line, nose close to the ground, reading scents that no machine could understand. Daniel remembered the first day they worked together clearly, the way the handler instructor had handed him the leash and said only a few words. Trust him more than you trust your own instincts. It had sounded like an exaggeration at the time, but the desert had a way of teaching lessons quickly. Rex had proven himself again and again, stopping without warning in the middle of a path or circling slowly around patches of earth that looked perfectly ordinary to human eyes. When Rex stopped, the patrol stopped. When Rex moved forward again, the Marines followed. There had been no hesitation in those moments, no doubt. Only the quiet certainty that the dog knew something the rest of them did not. Daniel could still remember kneeling beside Rex during long pauses in the shade of a broken wall while distant wind carried sand across the ground. The shepherd would sit beside him, ears forward, patient and alert, waiting for the next signal to move. They had shared water from the same canteen more than once, the dog lapping carefully while Daniel poured it slowly into a metal lid. No words were needed. Out there, trust had been simple, clear. If Rex stepped forward, Daniel followed. If Rex froze, Daniel stopped. That silent partnership had carried them through months of long patrols and quiet roads that seemed endless beneath the sun. Now, sitting in the soft morning light of his living room thousands of miles away, Daniel looked down at the German shepherd lying beside the couch and realized something that had not been obvious before. Rex was watching him the same way he had watched those desert roads, calm but ready, reading every movement, every breath, every small change in Daniel's posture. The dog had not left his post. The battlefield had simply changed. The memory of the desert lingered in Daniel Carter's mind long after the morning light had filled the room. And for a moment the quiet house on Maple Ridge Road seemed to hold two worlds at once, the calm of Colorado and the distant echo of long patrol roads that stretched under a relentless sun. Daniel leaned forward slightly on the couch, his forearms resting on his knees, while Rex remained close to the floor beside him, calm and still, but listening with the alert patience of a dog who had spent years measuring the smallest changes in the world around him. Daniel remembered one particular morning from those days overseas, a morning that had begun like dozens before it. The sky had been pale and cloudless, the early air already warming as Marines prepared their gear beside a dusty outpost that stood at the edge of a quiet village road. Engines hummed softly while boots moved across packed dirt, and Rex had stood beside Daniel, ears forward, tail low, waiting for the signal that meant it was time to begin walking again. When Daniel clipped the leash to Rex's harness that day, the dog had stepped forward with steady confidence, nose low, reading the ground as if the earth itself spoke to him. The patrol moved slowly, each step deliberate, the kind of careful movement that comes when every person trusts the animal leading them. For nearly half a mile the road had seemed ordinary, a narrow stretch of pale dirt bordered by low stone walls and scattered brush that barely moved in the dry wind. Then Rex had stopped. Not suddenly, not in panic, just a quiet halt that froze the entire patrol line behind him. Daniel remembered the way the dog's posture changed in that moment. Rex lowered his head closer to the ground, his ears tightening slightly, as if listening to something buried beneath the silence. Daniel had raised a hand immediately, signaling the Marines behind him to hold their position. No one argued. No one stepped forward. They all trusted the shepherd standing in the road. Daniel knelt beside Rex, resting a hand gently along the dog's back while studying the patch of earth ahead. It looked no different from the rest of the road, pale dust scattered across small stones, nothing unusual to the human eye. But Rex remained still, his breathing slow, his focus locked on that exact spot. The patrol waited. The desert wind brushed across the road in soft waves, carrying the distant scent of dry grass and warm earth. Minutes passed before a team approached carefully to inspect the ground further down the road, and when they finally confirmed what Rex had sensed long before any machine could detect it, Daniel had only glanced at the shepherd beside him and nodded once. "Good boy." That was all he said. Rex wagged his tail once, small and restrained, then returned his attention to the road as if the moment had never been extraordinary. Sitting now in the quiet warmth of his living room, Daniel looked down at the same dog resting beside his couch and realized that Rex had never changed the way he watched the world. The shepherd still listened for signals no one else could hear. Only now the road he guarded was not a desert path beneath a distant sun. It was the fragile peace inside a quiet house where his Marine was still learning how to breathe again. The memory of that desert road faded slowly as the quiet house returned around Daniel Carter, the soft hum of the heater and the distant rustle of pine trees outside replacing the dry wind of a land thousands of miles away. Rex remained beside the couch where he had settled earlier, his body relaxed but his attention still fixed on Daniel with the quiet loyalty that had defined every day of their partnership. Daniel leaned back against the worn cushions and closed his eyes for a moment, but the stillness did not last long. Something in the room shifted. It was subtle, the kind of change most people would never notice, a tightening in the chest, a sudden alertness in the mind that arrived without warning. Daniel inhaled slowly, but the breath felt shallow, as if the air had grown heavier without explanation. His fingers curled slightly against his knees. He had felt this before, many times. The doctors had called it an episode, a wave of memory that the body reacted to before the mind understood what was happening. In those moments the present blurred with the past, and the quiet safety of a living room could suddenly feel like a place that demanded constant vigilance. Rex noticed the shift instantly. The shepherd lifted his head, ears rising forward, his gaze locking onto Daniel with sudden intensity. The dog stood up without making a sound and stepped closer to the couch, his paws soft against the wooden floor. Daniel had not spoken, had not moved more than a few inches, yet Rex read the signs the way he once read the ground beneath desert roads. Daniel's breathing shortened slightly, his shoulders tightening as his mind drifted somewhere he did not want to go. The quiet room seemed smaller. The clock on the wall ticked louder than before. Rex placed himself directly beside Daniel's knee and sat down firmly, close enough that the warmth of his body pressed against Daniel's leg. Daniel's eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, as if waking from a place far away. Rex did not bark. He did not whine. Instead, he leaned forward and gently rested the side of his head against Daniel's thigh. The contact was steady and deliberate. Daniel froze for a moment, surprised by the sudden weight beside him. His breathing hesitated once, then again. Rex stayed exactly where he was, his presence calm and grounded, the quiet strength of an animal who understood that something invisible had just entered the room. Slowly Daniel placed one hand against the shepherd's neck, his fingers brushing through the thick fur, as if confirming that the moment was real. The rhythm of Rex's breathing remained slow and even, and after a few seconds Daniel's own breath began to follow that same pattern. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. Outside the window a truck passed on the distant road, the sound fading quickly through the trees. Inside the house the tension eased little by little until the room felt like itself again. Daniel looked down at the dog beside him, his hand still resting on Rex's neck, and a quiet realization formed in the back of his mind. Rex had not moved closer by accident. The shepherd had recognized the warning signs long before Daniel himself understood what was happening. The dog had responded the same way he always had on patrol, calmly, without hesitation, protecting his partner from danger that no one else could see. The room stayed quiet after Daniel Carter felt his breathing return to normal, and for several long seconds he did not move his hand from Rex's neck. The shepherd remained steady beside him, warm and grounded, the slow rhythm of the dog's breathing filling the space where tension had lived only moments before. Outside the window the morning had brightened, sunlight slipping through the tall pine branches and stretching across the living room floor in long pale lines. Daniel leaned back slightly into the couch, exhaling in a deeper breath now, the kind that came easier once the invisible pressure inside his chest had begun to loosen. Rex lifted his head slowly, but did not step away. Instead, he stayed close, watching Daniel carefully the way he had watched patrol routes years earlier. It was the same quiet attention, the same patience that once kept entire teams safe without anyone needing to say a word. Daniel glanced toward the clock on the wall, noticing that only a few minutes had passed, though the moment had felt longer. Time had a strange way of bending when memories try to surface. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand and looked down again at the shepherd beside him. Rex's amber eyes met his calmly. The dog's tail rested against the floor without movement, his posture relaxed yet ready, as if he were waiting for the next signal that might require him to step forward again. Daniel remembered something Dr. Helen Brooks had mentioned during their last appointment at the veterinary clinic. She had explained that some dogs who served alongside soldiers learned to read their handlers so deeply that the bond did not fade once the uniform came off. The dog watched breathing patterns, muscle tension, small shifts, in posture, signals too subtle for most people to recognize. At the time Daniel had listened politely, but had not given the explanation much thought. Now the meaning of those words settled differently in his mind. Rex had not simply followed him home from the base. Rex had continued the same mission they had shared overseas. The battlefield had changed, but the responsibility had not. Daniel slowly reached down and scratched behind the shepherd's ear, his fingers moving through the thick fur in a familiar motion that once happened every day during their service together. Rex's ears relaxed slightly at the touch, and his tail thumped once against the wooden floor, soft and restrained. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the quiet warmth of recognition. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile, something that had become rare in recent months. For the first time since sitting down that morning, he did not feel like the house was pressing inward around him. Rex remained beside him, calm and present, as if guarding a space that allowed Daniel to breathe without fear of what might rise from memory. Outside the wind shifted through the pines again, carrying the crisp scent of mountain air through a small crack in the window frame. Daniel glanced toward the door that led to the backyard where the snow had begun to melt along the fence line. He looked back at Rex and spoke quietly, his voice steady in a way it had not been earlier. "Let us get some air, partner." Rex stood immediately, alert but relaxed, ready to follow wherever Daniel chose to walk next. The back door creaked softly as Daniel Carter pushed it open, and a breath of cold Colorado air slipped into the house, carrying the clean scent of pine, damp soil, and melting snow. Rex stepped through the doorway first with the quiet confidence of a dog who had walked ahead of his handler thousands of times before, his paws landing gently on the wooden porch before he paused and looked back toward Daniel, as if confirming that the path ahead was clear. Daniel followed a moment later, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders while the crisp mountain air brushed against his face. The backyard stretched quietly behind the small house, bordered by a weathered wooden fence and a line of tall pine trees that swayed slowly in the morning wind. Patches of snow still clung to the shaded corners of the yard, but along the fence line thin streams of water trickled through the grass where the sun had begun to melt the frost. Rex moved a few steps forward into the yard, his nose lifting slightly as he studied the scents carried on the breeze. For a moment, the shepherd simply stood there, alert but calm, his ears shifting with every distant sound. Somewhere far down Maple Ridge Road, a truck engine rumbled briefly before fading away again. The quiet that followed felt different outdoors, wider somehow, as if the open sky above them had room to hold the thoughts Daniel could not easily leave behind inside the house. Daniel stepped off the porch and walked slowly across the yard, the grass damp beneath his boots. Rex kept a steady pace beside him, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, simply matching each step the way he had done for years during patrols that demanded perfect coordination. Daniel stopped near the fence where the sunlight fell warm across the clearing and rested his forearms on the wooden rail. From here he could see the distant slope of the mountain ridge beyond town, the pine forest stretching miles into the horizon. The view had been one of the reasons he chose this place after returning home. Quiet land, wide sky, fewer people. Rex circled once in the grass before settling down nearby, his posture relaxed but attentive as always. Daniel remained at the fence longer than he expected, watching the slow movement of clouds above the ridge. Out here the silence felt less crowded than the quiet inside the house. The wind moved through the trees with a steady whisper, and somewhere high above a hawk traced slow circles across the pale sky. Daniel breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs. Beside him Rex lifted his head again, watching Daniel the same careful way he had inside the living room earlier. The shepherd seemed to sense that something inside his Marine was still shifting, still adjusting to a life that no longer followed the rigid rhythm of patrol routes and command calls. Daniel glanced down at the dog and gave a small nod without realizing he had done it. Rex responded the way he always had. His tail moved once against the grass, calm and certain, as if the message had been understood. Whatever came next, wherever Daniel chose to walk from this moment forward, the dog would already be there beside him, ready to follow the same quiet mission that had always guided them both. Daniel Carter remained leaning against the wooden fence for a long time, watching the clouds move slowly across the pale blue sky above the mountain ridge. The wind had softened now, and the quiet of the morning seemed to settle into the yard like a blanket laid gently over the land. Rex stayed nearby in the grass, his body relaxed but never careless, the shepherd's amber eyes drifting between Daniel, the tree line, and the distant road beyond the property. The rhythm was familiar to him. Observe. Wait. Stay ready. After a while Daniel pushed himself away from the fence and stepped across the damp grass, his boots leaving faint impressions where the frost had melted into the soil. Rex rose immediately, falling into step beside him with the same easy precision he once used on patrol. They walked slowly along the fence line toward the back corner of the yard where the trees stood thicker and the sunlight filtered through the branches in thin golden beams. Daniel had walked this path many times since moving here, usually alone. The distance from the porch to the tree line was barely 40 yards, but it was far enough to feel like a small escape from the walls of the house. Rex moved slightly ahead now, his nose lowering toward the ground as he followed a trail only he could read. His tail remained level and calm, swaying once or twice as he stepped through the grass. Daniel watched him quietly. The dog's movements were confident but not restless, each step deliberate, each pause meaningful. Rex had always walked like that, even as a young dog during training. The instructors used to say that the best working dogs did not rush. They listened first. Near the edge of the trees Rex stopped suddenly, and lifted his head. His ears angled toward the forest, catching a sound Daniel could not hear. The shepherd stood perfectly still for several seconds before relaxing again, deciding whatever moved beyond the trees was not worth concern. Daniel noticed the moment clearly. The way Rex assessed the world never changed. He did not react out of fear. He reacted out of awareness. Daniel stepped closer to the trees and rested his hand briefly against the rough bark of a pine trunk. The scent of resin and cold earth filled the air. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a small animal moved through dry leaves, the faint rustling drifting through the branches before fading again. Rex turned his head back toward Daniel and walked over, stopping close enough that his shoulder brushed lightly against Daniel's leg. The contact was small but intentional. Daniel looked down and met the dog's steady gaze. For the second time that morning, he felt that quiet understanding settle between them again. Rex had not only followed him into this yard. The shepherd had followed him through every unseen moment since they returned home. Daniel reached down and rested his hand along Rex's back, his fingers pressing gently into the thick fur while the wind stirred the pine branches overhead. For the first time in a long while, the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt shared. Daniel Carter kept his hand resting along Rex's back for a few seconds before letting it fall slowly to his side, and the two of them stood there near the pine trees as the wind moved gently through the branches overhead. The morning had grown brighter now, the sunlight spreading across the yard and warming the damp grass where patches of frost had melted away. Rex shifted his weight slightly and stepped forward, his nose lowering again toward the ground as he followed another faint scent trail through the clearing. Daniel watched him move, the dog's posture calm but purposeful, every motion guided by instincts that years of training had sharpened rather than erased. For a moment, Daniel felt the quiet rhythm of the scene settle inside him, the same steady calm that sometimes appeared during the long pauses between patrols when the world seemed to hold its breath. Rex circled once near the base of a fallen branch and then stopped again, lifting his head toward the tree line as if measuring the distance between the yard and the forest beyond. Daniel stepped closer, the soft crunch of damp grass beneath his boots breaking the stillness for just a moment. He rested his hand lightly on the wooden fence post nearby and followed Rex's line of sight toward the trees. Nothing obvious moved in the shadows between the trunks, only the shifting pattern of sunlight and wind brushing across the ground. Rex relaxed again and turned back toward Daniel, walking the few steps needed to stand beside him. The shepherd looked up calmly, his amber eyes steady and patient. Daniel understood that look better now than he had weeks earlier. Rex was not searching for danger. He was checking on his marine. Daniel inhaled slowly and felt the cool mountain air settle deeper in his lungs than it had earlier that morning. The tightness that had followed him through so many days seemed to loosen slightly with every breath. Rex stepped forward once more and brushed his shoulder gently against Daniel's leg before moving ahead along the narrow path that ran beside the fence. Daniel followed without hesitation. They walked side by side through the yard, the distance between the house and the trees shrinking behind them as the open sky stretched above the clearing. The rhythm of their footsteps returned naturally, the same quiet coordination they had learned long ago in a different landscape. Rex did not pull ahead. Daniel did not fall behind. They simply moved together. Halfway back toward the porch, Rex paused again, this time glancing toward the road beyond the property where a distant engine sound drifted briefly through the trees. The shepherd listened for a moment and then relaxed when the sound faded away. Daniel noticed the pause and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the silent report. Rex resumed walking, satisfied that the morning remained peaceful. By the time they reached the porch steps, the sunlight had warmed the wooden boards enough to melt the last thin edge of frost. Daniel stopped there and looked out across the yard once more, the quiet space now carrying a different feeling than when he first stepped outside. Rex sat down beside him, calm and watchful, his presence steady like a silent promise that the path forward would never be walked alone. Daniel Carter remained standing on the porch for a while after Rex settled beside him, the quiet morning stretching across the yard like a moment that did not need to hurry. The sun had climbed higher above the pine trees now, warming the wooden boards beneath his boots and sending thin ribbons of light across the grass where frost had melted into clear drops of water. Rex sat calmly at Daniel's side, his posture relaxed but attentive, the shepherd's ears turning occasionally toward distant sounds that drifted through the valley beyond Maple Ridge Road. Daniel rested one hand against the porch railing and looked across the property with a slower, steadier breath than he had taken earlier that morning. Something had shifted during their walk across the yard, something small but real. The tight weight that had followed him through so many quiet hours seemed lighter now, as if the open air had carried some of it away into the wide Colorado sky. Rex lifted his head slightly and glanced toward Daniel, his amber eyes calm and certain. The shepherd had always watched him that way, even during the long months after they returned home. Daniel understood that look more clearly now. Rex was not simply guarding the yard or listening for passing trucks along the distant road. Rex was watching him, waiting, making sure his partner was steady before the next step forward. Daniel exhaled slowly and allowed himself to lean against the railing, the wood warm beneath his palm. From the porch, he could see the narrow path they had just walked across the grass, a simple line leading from the trees back to the house. It was not much of a distance, maybe 40 yards at most, but the quiet walk had felt longer in a different way. Each step beside Rex had carried a small reminder of something Daniel had nearly forgotten. Out on patrol, the distance between danger and safety had often been decided by trust alone. If Rex moved forward, Daniel followed. If Rex stopped, Daniel stopped. There had never been hesitation between them. The partnership had always been simple, clear. Now Daniel realized that the same trust had quietly followed them home. The battles they faced were no longer on distant roads beneath a harsh sun, but Rex had not abandoned his role. The shepherd still listened for signals, still watched Daniel's breathing, his posture, the smallest shift in his voice. Rex stood up slowly beside him and stretched, his front paws reaching forward across the boards before he settled again at Daniel's feet. The movement was calm and familiar, the easy motion of a dog who felt comfortable standing guard in a place that belonged to him. Daniel looked down and gave a small nod without realizing it. Rex responded with a gentle thump of his tail against the porch floor. For the first time in many months, Daniel allowed a quiet thought to settle fully in his mind. They had both come home carrying more than anyone could see, but neither of them had to carry it alone anymore. The morning wind brushed softly through the pine trees beyond the fence, and Daniel straightened his shoulders as he looked out across the yard once more. Rex remained beside him, steady and patient, ready to walk whatever path came next. Daniel Carter stayed on the porch a little longer after that thought settled in his mind, letting the quiet stretch around him while the morning sun climbed higher above the ridge. The light had grown warmer now, spreading across the yard and touching the tops of the pine trees beyond the fence. Rex remained close beside him, calm and steady, his gaze shifting occasionally toward the road and then back to Daniel, as if confirming that the world around them remained peaceful. After a moment, Daniel stepped down from the porch, his boots touching the grass again with a soft sound that barely disturbed the stillness of the yard. Rex rose immediately and moved beside him, falling into the same quiet rhythm they had shared earlier that morning. They walked slowly along the fence line again, not because there was anywhere specific to go, but because the movement itself felt right. Daniel noticed something as they walked. Rex no longer seemed tense in the way he sometimes had during the first weeks after returning home. The shepherd's steps were confident but relaxed, his tail level, his ears attentive without strain. It was the posture of a dog who understood his surroundings and trusted them. Daniel paused halfway across the yard and looked down at Rex, studying the dog's expression the same way Rex often studied him. The shepherd looked back with patient focus, waiting the way he always had when Daniel stopped on a patrol route. For a brief moment, Daniel remembered another quiet pause from years earlier, when he had crouched beside Rex during a long patrol break while the sun lowered across the desert horizon. The team had waited nearly 20 minutes for instructions that afternoon, sitting along a low stone wall while the wind carried dust across the road. Rex had stayed beside Daniel the entire time, calm and alert, watching the distant path the same way he watched the yard now. Daniel had scratched behind the dog's ear during that pause and said something simple that the other Marines had laughed about later. "Best partner I ever had." At the time it had sounded like an easy compliment, the kind soldiers share without thinking too deeply about it. Standing in his quiet backyard now, Daniel realized how true those words had always been. Rex had never questioned the road ahead. He had never doubted the man at the other end of the leash. He had simply shown up every day ready to walk forward together. Daniel crouched down slowly and rested one knee against the damp grass. Rex stepped closer at once, leaning into the familiar gesture with quiet trust. Daniel placed both hands along the sides of the shepherd's neck and looked directly into the dog's steady eyes. For the first time since returning home, he felt the weight of those months begin to loosen inside his chest. Not disappear entirely, but shift enough to allow something else to grow in its place. Rex wagged his tail once, slow and calm, as if acknowledging a signal that only the two of them understood. Daniel stood up again and looked toward the open yard where the sunlight stretched across the grass. Rex moved beside him without hesitation. The path forward no longer felt uncertain. It simply felt like the next step they would take together. The morning had settled into a quiet rhythm across Maple Ridge Road, and the sunlight now filled the entire yard with a warm glow that softened the sharp edges of the melting frost. Daniel Carter stood near the center of the grass with Rex beside him, both of them facing the open space where the fence met the line of tall pine trees. The air felt different than it had earlier that day. The same wind moved through the branches. The same distant sounds drifted across the valley. Yet something inside Daniel had shifted in a way that made the silence feel less heavy. Rex sensed it immediately. The shepherd stood calmly at Daniel's side, his posture relaxed but attentive, the same quiet balance he had carried through years of service. Daniel walked slowly across the yard once more, not out of habit this time, but out of choice. Rex followed beside him without hesitation, the two of them moving in that familiar rhythm that had always guided their partnership. The grass brushed softly against Daniel's boots while the morning breeze carried the clean scent of pine and damp soil through the open space. When they reached the fence again, Daniel rested his arms along the wooden rail and looked toward the distant ridge. The mountains rose quietly beyond the town, their dark green slopes stretching toward the pale blue sky. For months after returning home, Daniel had stood in this same spot feeling as though the distance between his past and his present was impossible to cross. The memories had followed him everywhere. Long roads beneath a harsh sun. Endless hours of watchful silence. The responsibility of leading men and trusting a dog whose instincts often meant the difference between danger and safety. Those memories had not disappeared, but something about this morning allowed them to settle differently inside him. Rex moved closer and sat beside Daniel again, his shoulder gently brushing against Daniel's leg. The shepherd looked up calmly, his amber eyes steady and patient. Daniel glanced down and placed his hand along the dog's back in a slow, familiar motion. The warmth of the thick fur beneath his palm carried a quiet reassurance that needed no explanation. Rex had not come home broken. Rex had come home ready to keep doing what he had always done. Protect his partner. Watch the road ahead. Daniel exhaled slowly and let his gaze drift back across the yard where the sunlight now stretched from the porch to the tree line in one wide golden path. For the first time since returning home, he understood something simple but powerful. The war had changed them both, but it had not taken away the bond that carried them through it. That bond had simply followed them home, waiting for the moment when Daniel was ready to trust it again. Rex's tail moved once against the grass, calm and steady, as if confirming the thought without needing words. Daniel straightened and stepped away from the fence, turning back toward the house. Rex stood immediately and moved beside him, ready to walk the path once more. This time the steps felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because the future no longer looked like a road Daniel had to walk alone. Daniel Carter walked slowly toward the porch, with Rex moving beside him, the wooden steps waiting quietly in the warm light of the late morning. The yard behind them had grown still again, the wind softer now as it drifted through the pine trees along the fence. When Daniel reached the porch, he paused before stepping up, turning once more to look across the stretch of grass that had felt so different only a few hours earlier. The sunlight covered the clearing from edge to edge, bright and calm, and the narrow path they had walked together was faintly visible where the damp grass bent under their footsteps. Rex stopped beside him and followed Daniel's gaze across the yard, his ears lifting slightly while he studied the quiet space, as if memorizing it the same way he once memorized patrol routes far from home. After a moment, Daniel climbed the steps and stepped onto the porch again. The boards creaked softly under his boots, the familiar sound echoing through the still morning air. Rex followed without hesitation and settled near the door, his posture relaxed but watchful as always. Daniel leaned against the porch railing and looked out across Maple Ridge Road where the distant mountains rose beyond the line of trees. The world looked ordinary from here. A small house, a quiet road, a yard surrounded by pine and open sky. Nothing about the place hinted at the long road that had brought them both here. Yet Daniel understood something now that he had not fully seen before. The quiet life waiting in front of him did not erase the past. It did not need to. The lessons carried home from distant places were not meant to vanish. They were meant to guide the steps that followed. Rex stood and walked a few feet closer, his shoulder brushing gently against Daniel's leg in the same calm gesture he had used earlier that morning. Daniel rested his hand along the dog's back once more, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm. The shepherd's tail moved slowly against the wooden floor, a quiet sign of trust that had never been broken even during the hardest months after returning home. Daniel looked down at Rex and spoke softly, his voice calm and certain. "We are going to be all right, partner." Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of the words, his amber eyes steady as if the promise had already been understood long before it was spoken. For a moment the two of them stood together in the sunlight, the wind moving gently through the trees beyond the yard while the quiet house waited behind them. Then Daniel pushed the door open and stepped inside, and Rex followed at once, crossing the threshold with the same quiet confidence he had carried through every road they had ever walked together. The house was silent again, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt like a place where two soldiers could finally rest, knowing that whatever came next they would face it the same way they always had. Side by side, steady and unafraid.